Hi, so I recently polished off on my Kindle an ebook. It's by a fellow named Steve Ross. Yeah, I'm not going to review the book per se here, and I will just say right off the bat it's a decent read, and I encourage anybody with similar story or curiosity as me, being between two countries, Thailand and the U.S., to go ahead and it's worth paying whatever it was, $5, $6. It wasn't too expensive for the book. I mean, he's written a lot more other books, but none of the other books really have drawn my interest. Steve Ross, he's somebody that I don't know personally. I never met him directly, but common friends that we know uh, have both mentioned either of us to each other for our similar drives here. So basically, what drove me to this book and why did I decide to download it and read it, and I read it pretty quickly. So it's one of those books. He's a decent enough writer. It's a compilation of several essays that he wrote, and it's all on the theme of him, as the book is titled, "Leaving Thailand." When I was an editor in Phuket, Thailand, and this is like 2011, 2012. I'd been in Thailand already at that time for about 10 years already. Had graduated university, had done all the teaching. After that, after graduating university, my initial plan was to come back to the U.S. and teach here because I taught in Thailand a lot, right? So I came back to the U.S. This is a side story. Came back to the U.S. I actually went to this like residency program, got pretty far in the interview stage, but I didn't actually land that job, and that was in Denver at the time for teaching. So I got back on my plane to Thailand. And I was like, okay, let's figure out what's going on. Just went with the flow, and as you do when you go with the flow, something pops up in life. As long as you're true to yourself and you're just open-minded, and at that time that was a job at the Phuket Gazette. And, my wife and her family are from Phuket, and I was down there at the time, and I got a call back for a job, and that ended up planting a seed uh, for me to continue on in journalism and writing and corporate editing, which I am on this path today, 10 years later. So working with the Phuket Gazette, I was still motivated with my family. I had a young kid at the time, so he would have been like, I guess, 5 years old, 5, 6 years old, 5, 6, 7 years old at that period of my life. And of course, I was still motivated to bring him back to the U.S. All the opportunities for education, because anybody who knows and has been in that boat in Thailand, as far as schools, you have that struggle. It's like, oh well, can I afford to send him to a good school, an international school, or English speaking school? And a lot of people can't, or it's a very much of a struggle to do so. And so, of course, the answer, if you're an American or you're European, is of course bring them back to the West. Free schools that are paid for by tax dollars, and I mean, there's free schools in Thailand too, so it's the same thing, right? But of course, the notion, at least it was back then, definitely is that the schools are much higher quality. Even the free public schools in America and in Europe, for that matter, are much higher quality. So if you're a parent and you don't have a lot of money, it's a no-brainer. Go back to the West. And so I was on that train of thought as well in those times. But I remember some these common friends I told you about but both Steve and I knew, but of course I never knew Steve directly. They had told me, a few people actually told me over the years, kind of warning, or at least telling me that I reminded them of this guy, Steve Ross, who had once upon a time in the late 1990s had done the same thing. He had got up, brought his family, his Thai wife, and his Thai-born kids back to the U.S. with the same motivation, same passion that I had. Going back to the U.S. was the next thing for me, and kind of like, oh, well, you sure you want to do that? I knew this guy named Steve Ross, kind of thing, yeah? And basically the story of that, and this is long before he had written this book called Leaving Thailand, his memoirs, right? But the whole story at that time was that it was a disaster for him. He got back to the U.S. and his wife went astray, and she became a lesbian and all this other stuff. That was the story I got back then, not having read the full book exactly what happened. But, well, there wasn't a book at that time. But anyway, and they're saying, maybe you should reconsider it. You got it good here in Thailand. You got this nice job. I mean, nice enough. It was, something other than teaching. And it didn't pay much more than teaching, to be honest. It really paid about the same amount as teaching in those days. So So I think I was starting off at like 40,000 baht a month, Thai baht a month. So whatever that was at that time, $1,400 a month salary. But it's plenty of money for Thailand if you're good with your expenses and you're able to adapt and not necessarily live frugally, but you don't spend too much, you don't have debt and everything. I did start accumulating debt. That's a different story. At that time, the first thing you get when you work for a corporate job anywhere in the world is, of course, you need to get a car, you need insurance, you need to start paying payments, all that. But anyway, besides the point, I was still motivated, and I was kind of curious. So Steve Ross, so this guy went to America. What happened to him? Um, I won't name the common friends, but yeah, a few different common friends who knew Steve Ross and knew his story, kind of like telling me, well, maybe you should reconsider it. It didn't really work out good for him, basically, was the story I got from that. Anyway, fast forward to more recent times. I guess I had left the Phuket. Let's go back a little bit. So I had left Phuket as an editor roughly 2016, and I moved to Bangkok to pursue another corporate job. The job I currently work, which is in the international sea trade industry, and so communications, of course. So I was basically building on my foundation for writing and editing, and a good common friend that I was talking to and I still talk to a lot to this day had told me as well, reminded me again. This is probably the second time. So the original, when I was originally working in Phuket, it was somebody else who was telling me about Steve Ross character. And so the second friend in 2016, 2017, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. But anyway, 2016, 2017, I'm leaving my job as managing editor of the Phuket News. And so I had done the whole editor in Phuket for 4 years, I guess, 2011, 2016, 5 years basically. Had done radio, everything. And it was time to move on. And not only that, I was also still considering going back to the U.S. Just wasn't quite ready. And I had this opportunity pop up, in Bangkok with this regional sea trade association as initially communications officer. Sorry, sun's getting in my eyes here. But then later as I would be promoted to communications manager. But anyway, so a common friend of ours, of Steve Ross and me, had again warned me, like, hey, you don't want to go back to the U.S. My friend Steve, he did that and this and that, right? And so I was like, well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. My son was getting older at that time, so he's already 10, 11, and he's already, at the time he was actually going to international school. So I actually made it happen as an editor then in Phuket. But still, I wanted more. I wanted to come back to my family in the U.S., all that shenanigans. And so he told me again, he's like, oh, it's my good friend Steve Ross, he still misses Thailand to this day, and he's going to come back and this and that. Long story short, around that time, maybe not a few years after the fact, I think Steve Ross published his memoirs called Leaving Thailand. And so I was initially going to oh yeah, I'll download it, but I was pretty busy at that time in my life, and I wasn't reading too much initially making that transition. Didn't really have much mind space to be reading, and so kind of skipped it. And I did find him on Facebook, Steve Ross, and said, hey man, I'd like to meet you someday and talk to you, bounce ideas off, considering we had mutual friends. He accepted me at first, and he was kind of open at first, but somewhere along the lines, I don't know what happened. I think he posted some political, he used Facebook a lot for posting political stuff on one side of the spectrum, which I don't necessarily agree with. On the other side of the spectrum, not important at all. Anyway, Facebook's not the place to throw out your dirty laundry or your political views in general. But hey, eventually people will figure that out. But anyway, I think that's what happened. And he blocked and deleted me for no reason. I never met him, never had a fight with him, but must have seen something I must have posted once upon a time, which is obviously something I'm never going to do again as far as Facebook. I don't share, that's not the place, metaverse or whatever it's called, to share your political views or your opinions. But a lot of people still get sucked into that, and I did too. But anyway, beside the point. So he's someone I never got to meet, and I probably will never meet. But anyway, I did recently I saw Steve Ross in an interview on Irish Times. 2 interviews or something. This Irish Times, if you don't know, is this channel that has a lot of great interviews with mostly Thailand themed content. So mostly expats who live in Thailand for many years, or doing, unique interviews and perspective. And he's got more than 50, 60 plus interviews, and they're all pretty good so far that I can see. But one of them was with Steve Ross, and this was pretty recent. And I was looking at this interview, listening to his interview. Oh yeah, I know, I remember Steve Ross. And so it kind of tells about his story, you know, in a nutshell on this Irish Times interview. And then, of course, he mentions his book. He's like, okay, all the details are in his book. And I was like, oh, yeah, that book. Nowadays I'm in a lot more of a headspace to be able to read. And I kind of need to read a lot in between my job because my job is pretty hectic. And I'm still working for the same organization based in Thailand. But anyway, my job is pretty hectic as far as editorial and writing services. And so it helps a lot to read. So I don't mind, reading in between just to kind of maintain my sanity. But anyway, so yeah, so okay, I'll go. So I looked up the book and I found it. I downloaded it. It was $6, and I read the story. And yeah, finally got to hear from the horse's mouth, as they say, Steve Ross's story about him leaving Thailand and his decision, and basically all the regret he went through over the years, and to find out. And it turns out, you should go ahead and read the book. You should go ahead and read the book if you find any of it interesting, from me telling from my perspective here. But his regret of leaving Thailand, I don't think he necessarily had regret for his original purpose and his original intent, and he makes that pretty clear in his book. And his original intent was for his kids. If nobody else, and not for his wife, not for him, it was for his kids. And so he had to make the sacrifice. And his kids, he had a daughter and a son. He has a daughter and a son, and they're adults by now. Of course, this was the late '90s when they went back, and they were little young kids. And so his whole intention was to bring them back to the family, get them in public school, sounds like, and get them on their path and road to the opportunities of America. And that was his whole reason. And everything else aside from that was, it was a sacrifice for him to sacrifice his own life in Thailand and his happiness in Thailand for his personal reasons. Similarly, for me, coming back to the U.S., it's a sacrifice, for not only for the older son now, who's a teenager now. He's only got a few years left, so it's mainly for him. That was the whole point originally when my son was only 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it took a while. Finally got back 2021, at the end of 2021, by circumstances of fate that really ultimately brought me back. So it was getting pretty close where my window for coming back was going to close. I went through all the motions I mentioned in 2016, 17. We had gotten my wife's, basically her green card. Well, it's called a IR one, immediate relative one. So it's basically your immigrant visa. She had an immigrant visa approved in Bangkok, and of course we were one of the last waves of people to do that directly from direct consular filing via Bangkok, because they closed that office around that time, right in the time leading up to COVID. I think it was 2017-18. So basically they were redirecting everybody who would have previously qualified to do direct consular filing via the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok would have to go the same route as everyone else, I believe, through basically for the U.S., which is a lot longer. So you saved a lot of time by doing that. Anyway, we had done all that right about the same time I came up to Bangkok for my interview with the organization I currently work for. We were coming for her final interview. When we were about to head back to Phuket after she had done her interview, I got a call back from the job. And so basically we had the visa in hand, and over the years, every year I would just extend it. I would pay whatever it was. I can't think it was like $400 or something to reissue the visa. That's what you do basically. If you have a visa and you're not ready to use it, there's certain cases where you can pay to reissue it. So you just pay the visa fee again, and every year you have to do a new medical, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, long story short, is around the end of 2021, we were coming up to this crossroads where we had already extended her visa multiple years already, reissued her visa multiple years. And because of what was going on with COVID and all that stuff, we were coming to a point where we weren't going to be able to, or the conditions for renewing the visa or reissuing the visa per se, because like I said, it's tied to a new medical every year, and then also the direct consular services were minimal coming in and out of to the so-called pandemic, right? So we were coming to a point where we were either going to use it or lose it, her visa. So, and we were basically deciding at that time, considering all things at the end of 2020 and 2021, to lose it. and to just give it up once and for all after close to 15 years of worrying about that, and being on that path, like kind of being like half foot out the door, half foot in the door. We go to the U.S., we go to the U.S., and having it in hand, and then all of this stuff happening. Like, okay, well, we're going to lose it. We're going to just pursue. We're going to build a house in Thailand. I'm just going to continue on that path. But of course, as fate would have it, at the end of November 2021, my sister in the U.S. here passed away suddenly, mysteriously. And that basically was our calling card. And we literally had like 2 weeks, 3 weeks before her visa would have been expired, and that would have been that. And considering all things COVID and the way things are done now these days, there's a chance, my wife would have never gotten a visa, which I'm not going to get into here. But yeah, that was that. We had literally 2 weeks. Okay, well, I guess we're going to use her visa. We'll get over there. I got to go to the funeral, go see family at this hard time as my sister. So we used the visa, brought back my whole family in tow, including both my sons, who both have American citizenship. Something I made sure to do first thing when both of them were born. So of course, 16-year-old and the 3-year-old. So they weren't an issue, but it was just my wife's visa. And of course, our main thing was like, if we don't use it now and we don't get her secured in her permanent resident status, in the future, it's going to be very difficult, not impossible, to bring her back for anything. In the old days, you would get this 10-year for if you were married to an American citizen, your Thai wife or whatever wife from whatever country, you could qualify to get these 10-year visas pretty easily, just showing that you're married, you're definitely married, you have a established relationship, you have kids, and they would issue a 10-year visa. And that's how we came to U.S. the first time back in 2012. She had a 10-year visa. We only used it one time, but you get stamped in 6 months at a time. And so, but in later years, leading into COVID, not just because of COVID, but leading into COVID, a lot of policy changes on the State Department front. But they stopped reissuing these visas so much. And I know a lot of people, fellow Americans who had Thai wives, who had issues with this visa. Even one friend his wife had a 10-year visa, and they were using it quite frequently. They were going back every year and spending 4 or 5 months at a time in the U.S., and coming back to Thailand and coming back again. And they did it a few times, and at one point, the immigration just pulled his Thai wife at the Chicago O'Hare Airport, if I'm not mistaken, into the cold room, they call it, and said, "Hey, what are you doing? You're basically misusing this visa." And so she got through at that time, but that was the last straw. And I think they got the message that they weren't supposed to be doing that. And I had another friend also who's still in Thailand, and they have a daughter as well, Thai American daughter. And he had before his wife had the 10-year visa that, since the early 2000s, and they'd gone to the U.S. several times. She had gone to the U.S. several times as a proper visitor, to come back to visit family for a summer here or there. And then he had to renew the visa. His wife got denied basically 4 times they went to try to renew this visa. And he couldn't figure out why. It's basically the whim of the immigration. Oh, who's here? About why they wouldn't issue his wife a visa. So the long story short is that getting these visas is not so easy. And they basically want to encourage or mandate that these Thai women who are married to Americans, if they want to spend time in the U.S. as a U.S. family member, that they need to do immigrant visa. That's it. They don't want these Thai wives on visitor visas anymore, unless it's probably exceptions. If you got a lot of money and you literally own businesses or are an employer, they'll probably still issue that visa. But generally speaking, if you don't have all that, you're at the whim of the interviewer at the U.S. Embassy. So anyway, for us, it meant that, okay, well, we have this visa in hand. We need to activate it, and we need to come back and do what we've been planning to do for the better part of 15 years. And we did that. So here I am in the U.S. right now. My son just started his junior year at a local high school. Better late than never, they say. He's working full time. He's got his driver's permit. And I'm spending a lot of time with my toddler here, who just arrived. His main caretaker, and also in between my job. And yeah, so no regrets at all coming back yet. I do miss Thailand every single day. It's like Steve Ross in his book. Hey, buddy, where'd you go? Huh? Yeah, so miss Thailand every day. But I don't want to compare my story too much to Steve, saying that he did this and I'm in the same exact boat. I don't think I'm in the same exact boat at all. Contrary to some of the warnings I got early on from some common friends about thinking twice about coming back to the U.S. I have pretty clear objectives as well regarding my children and regarding our future prospects. My heart's still in Thailand, and I'll be back in Thailand within a month. The way things are going these days, um, it's better to have all cards on the table and not to burn any bridges for any opportunity you might have until you're absolutely sure that what you're doing, you want to get your roots deep into what you're doing, and that if that involves not intentionally burning any bridges, then hey, so be it. But generally speaking, if you're not at that position, you're not at that state of mind where you're 101% sure what you're doing is right, then yeah, you leave everything on the table. And that's basically what I've been doing for the last 15-20 years. And it's hard to kind of live in two worlds, between two worlds, one foot in, one foot out, which is basically having all the options and cards on the table there, that I can always have a contingency to fall back on. If my plan A is not what I thought it to be, or it's not turning out exactly as I had hoped, and I have a plan B or plan C, or second door number 3, door number 4. Obviously it's contingency planning, but it's a fine balance in making that plan work, because like I said, it could be pretty difficult once you're actually doing something. If you're not full in, if you don't put 100% into what you're doing, finding success to whatever it is that you are doing can be difficult, challenging, and sometimes some would even argue impossible if you don't put your full self into it. So it's a balance, finding that, putting your all in, but still having your contingency plans in order in case you need to use them. A contingency plan, in order for it to work, you need to maintain it to a certain extent. It's like, oh, okay, if this doesn't work, I'll just do that or something. But if you don't put any groundwork in, or you don't put any planning, or you don't build any, you don't have the bridges maintained, let's say, to in order to cross into that plan, or go into that door, it can be impossible to actually pursue those plans sometimes. And so it's been a challenge striking that balance, having enough maintenance on all these other bridges I've got going on, basically these two bridges, US and Thailand. And so as it stands today, I'm not digging roots deep in either country. I do have seeds planted in both countries. I'm a hybrid Thai American, so that's my nature, really, to be in between two worlds. But eventually, one day, the circumstances of the earth, of my existence, will force my hand, as it has done already, to bring us to the US to this extent. But someday I'll plant roots deep. I'll get into what I really want to do in life, and that's, of course, live with the land, live with the community and nature in harmony. And neither is possible at this stage in my life right now. Obviously, I can live here, I can live in a house in a nice community and get by. In Thailand, I was getting close. Like, okay, we were ready to start building, ready to start digging in our land. So I was getting pretty close, but as fate would have it, not yet. But, there'll come a time when I'm ready to dig deep. And hopefully it's with the right community, right type of people, and right circumstances. Not hopefully, that's exactly how it will be. It'll be with the right time, right people, right feeling. And I'll know when that time has come to really start digging deep in. But meanwhile, all I can do is just live in the moment now, make the most of what we got. And I think anybody who's been in a similar situation or is coming to a similar situation with myself, or guys like Steve Ross, and yeah, you'll agree that, yeah, all you can do is live in the now and enjoy every breath and every ray of sunshine that you've got with you while you've got it. And with that, I will end my little rant here and say thank you all for tuning in and listening to this, 20-something minute talk. And thank you all. We'll catch you again next time. Signing out.